The schoolroom fell silent the moment Miss Hargrove pointed at Clara Sutton and said, loud enough for every child in Ridgecrest, Colorado to hear, that some minds were simply too dull to hold a single word on a page, and Clara had believed her for 20 years. The autumn of 1873 had come hard to the San Juan Mountains, sweeping down from the peaks in long, cold curtains of amber and gold, stripping the aspens bare before October had even finished settling in. The town of Ridgecrest sat in a shallow valley between two ridges, a modest collection of timber buildings and false front storefronts arranged along a single main road that turned to mud when it rained and cracked like old pottery when the sun came back. There was a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a saloon that everyone pretended did not exist on Sunday mornings, and a small schoolhouse at the eastern edge of town that still smelled of chalk dust and the particular brand of shame that only a child can carry silently home. Clara Sutton was 22 years old and had not set foot inside that schoolhouse since the winter she turned 9, the winter Miss Hargrove had held up her reading primer in front of the class and announced to every child seated in those hard wooden benches that Clara could not recognize a single letter, not a one, and that perhaps her family ought to consider putting her to more practical use than wasting a seat meant for children with working minds. Clara had walked home through the snow that afternoon without her coat, having left it on the hook behind the door in her haste to disappear, and her mother had wrapped her in a quilt and said nothing, because her mother had never learned to read either and did not entirely understand why the absence of something she herself had never possessed should feel so much like losing it. But understanding and feeling were two different countries, and Clara had lived her whole life in the second one. She had grown into a young woman of quiet competence and fierce pride. She could cook over an open fire in the wind, could mend harness leather with an awl and a length of waxed thread, could calculate the fair price of a bolt of calico by feel and instinct and years of listening carefully to numbers being spoken aloud. She could read the sky for weather, read a horse's posture for pain or fear, read the angle of a shadow to know the hour without a watch. She could do almost everything a person needed to do in a frontier town, except walk into the general store and read the label on a tin or sign her own name to a piece of paper without a cold sweat breaking across the back of her neck. Her father, Henry Sutton, had died the previous spring of a fever that took him in 9 days flat, and had left her the small homestead 2 miles east of Ridgecrest, 40 acres of good grazing land, a cabin that needed resealing along the north wall, a cow, 4 laying hens, and a debt at Callaway's general store that felt larger than the mountain behind it. Henry had been a man of few words and considerable stubbornness, and he had loved his daughter in the wordless shoulder-to-shoulder way of men who do not know how to speak love aloud, but will chop your wood without being asked and stand between you and anything that wants to hurt you. She missed him like a missing tooth, not constantly, but every time she reached for something she expected to find there. Her nearest neighbor was a man she had never spoken to directly. She knew of him the way you know things in a small mountain community, through bits of conversation overheard at the store, through the way people's voices shifted when his name came up. His name was Eli Cross, and he had been living on the adjoining property to her north for going on 3 years, having come down from further up in the range where he had spent 2 seasons trapping and living in a manner that the older men in town described with a mixture of admiration and unease. He was, by every account, a mountain man in the truest sense of the phrase, a man who had made himself out of hard seasons and harder choices, who knew the wilderness the way some men know Scripture, not just by heart, but in the marrow. Clara had seen him twice from a distance, once from her fence line while she was checking on the cow in early spring, and once passing through the edge of her property on the way to somewhere she did not track. Both times she had noted what was impossible to ignore. He was very large, wide in the shoulders, with the kind of build that came not from deliberate effort, but from years of physical labor against a landscape that does not negotiate. His hair was dark and worn a little long, curling slightly against the collar of his canvas coat, and his jaw carried a beard trimmed to roughly the width of a hand that had not met a razor in a month. He moved with an economy of motion that she associated with men who were never in a hurry, because they had learned that hurrying in the mountains was how you made mistakes that killed you. She had not spoken to him because she was, in her private heart, a little afraid. Not of him specifically, of being seen by someone new, of the way people could look at you when they found out. It was the second week of October when the fence line between their properties blew down in a night storm. 3 full panels of post and rail stacked flat by a white pine that had finally given up its roots to the wet ground and come down sideways. Clara stood in the gray morning light looking at the damage and doing a calculation that involved her remaining cash, the cost of new post timber, and the fact that she still needed to seal the north wall before the real cold came. None of the numbers added up to anything comfortable. She was standing there, arms folded against the chill, jaw set in the particular way it set when she was deciding something, when she heard boots on the frost-stiffened grass behind her. She turned. Eli Cross was closer than she expected, which meant she had not heard him coming until he was already there, which was mildly alarming in someone his size. He was carrying a double-headed axe over one shoulder as casually as another man might carry a walking stick. Up close, he was even more what he had appeared from a distance. The canvas coat hung open over a flannel shirt that did nothing to conceal the breadth of his chest, and his arms, where the sleeves were rolled to the forearm, were roped with muscle in the plain, unadorned way of a man who lifted real weight in real circumstances. His dark hair moved slightly in the morning wind. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of mountain clouds before snow, and they moved across the downed fence and the fallen pine with a practiced assessment that had nothing theatrical about it. He looked at the damage. Then he looked at her. "Morning," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, unhurried, with the particular flatness of a man who does not speak unless he has something to say. "Morning," she said. He looked at the fence again. "I can help with that." She wanted to say she was fine. The word was already forming itself in her throat with the reflexive speed of long habit. But she looked at the downed timber, and she looked at the axe on his shoulder, and she thought about the north wall, and she said instead, "I would appreciate that." He nodded as though this was the natural conclusion of a conversation they had already been having, set his axe against the standing section of fence, and crouched beside the fallen pine to measure the situation with his hands. He worked without excessive talking, which she appreciated. She went to get her own tools, and they spent the morning clearing the pine, he handling the heavy end of every log, she handling the smaller branches in the stacking, and neither of them making a production of this natural division of labor. By midday, the pine was cleared, and by mid-afternoon, 3 new panels of fence were up, the posts set deep enough that another fallen tree would have to try considerably harder. He had brought post timber from his own property without mentioning it. She noticed. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed. When the light began to lower itself behind the western ridge, and the temperature dropped in that sudden certain way it did in October at this elevation, she said, "I could offer you supper, if you have no pressing need to be elsewhere." He looked at the last post, gave it a firm push to test the set, and said, "That would be fine." Supper was salt pork and dried bean soup with cornbread cooked in the Dutch oven on the hearth, and Clara served it without apology, because she did not believe in apologizing for plain food prepared honestly. He ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had spent enough time eating trail food to know the difference, and he said the cornbread was good, which she believed because he took a second piece without ceremony. They talked, the way strangers talk at a shared table, in a careful, exploratory way. He told her he had been running a small cattle operation on his property, meaning to build it up slowly. She told him about the homestead, about the north wall, about the debt at Calloway's store. She told him about her father in the brief, plain way she had learned to speak of losses. A few sentences, not more, enough to give the shape of the thing without bleeding all over the table. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, with his full attention and no performance. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like a man who knew how to be a father." And something about the plainness of that observation, the way it did not reach for comfort but simply recognized the fact, loosened something in her chest that had been tight all day. After the plates were cleared, he happened to glance at the small shelf by the door where her father's few books were kept, 3 volumes in a row, their spines dusty because she did not touch them. She saw his eyes go there, and she felt the cold that always came with that particular direction of attention, the anticipatory shame, the waiting for the question that would expose everything. He did not ask a question. He got up, moved to the shelf, and tilted one of the books slightly to read the spine. "Pilgrim's Progress," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he set it back without comment. She said, before she could stop herself, "I do not read." She heard the words come out and felt the exposure of them, the way she always did when the truth left her mouth before she had armored it properly. She was already building the wall back up, the carefully casual expression, the readiness to deflect, when he turned from the shelf and looked at her without any of the things she was prepared for. No pity, no amusement, no flicker of the contempt that Miss Hargrove had worn like a badge of professional honesty. He said, "A lot of good people don't." She said, "The school teacher said I was not capable of learning." He held her gaze for a moment. His expression was not performing anything. He said, "School teachers can be wrong." She did not have an answer for that. She was not entirely sure she believed it, because she had carried Miss Hargrove's verdict the way you carry a stone in your boot, not always in your conscious mind, but always there, altering your gait. But she noticed that he said it simply, without drama, as though it were a plain fact available for her consideration, and he did not press it. He thanked her for supper, collected his axe from where it leaned against the outside of the cabin door, and walked back across the meadow toward his property in the gathering dark. She watched him go from the doorway, her arms folded against the cold, and she stood there for a minute after he had disappeared into the tree line, thinking about a thing she had not thought about in a very long time. What if she was wrong about what she could not do? He came back 4 days later to check the fence posts, which she knew was not strictly necessary for fence posts set that well. He came with a covered pot that contained a venison stew, and he said his herd had provided more than he needed for himself, which was the most indirect way anyone had ever offered her charity, and it was indirect enough that she could accept it without her pride catching fire. She heated the stew on the hearth, and they ate together again. This time, when the dishes were cleared, she looked at the shelf of books and then looked at him, and what came out of her mouth surprised her more than it surprised him. She said, "Would you read to me?" "One of those, if it is not a great imposition." He looked at the shelf, then back at her. She watched him consider the question, not the way a person considers whether to be polite, but the way a person considers whether they are equal to something they are being trusted with. "Which one?" he said. She crossed to the shelf. The 3 books were her father's, and she knew their covers by touch and by the illustrations on their bindings. She pulled out the middle one, a dark green cloth-bound volume with a pressed flower design on the cover. Her father had kept it on the shelf without explanation, and she had always thought he might have kept it for her mother, who had died when Clara was 4. She handed it to Eli. He turned it over in his hands. His hands were very large. She noticed this the way you notice something that becomes important only in retrospect. He opened the cover and read the title page in the quiet interior way of a person checking the weight of something before they lift it. "Nature," he said, "by Ralph Waldo Emerson." He looked up. "Have you heard of him?" "No," she said. "He writes about the land," Eli said, "about how a man stands in it, how it stands in him." She gestured to the chair by the hearth, the better of the 2 in the cabin, the one her father had always used. He settled into it without argument, opened the book to the first page, and began to read. His reading voice was different from his speaking voice, though both came from the same place, something low and deliberate, without performance, but with a kind of care for the words that she felt rather than analyzed. He read slowly enough that the sentences had time to form themselves in the air of the room, to become something she could see behind her eyes, the field, the woods, the way a man walking alone in the natural world could feel himself expanding rather than diminishing. She sat across from him with her hands in her lap, and she listened. Really listened, the way she had learned to listen to everything, because listening was how she had always gathered the world. He read for an hour. When he stopped, he closed the book on his thumb and looked over at her and said, "Enough for tonight?" She had meant to say yes, she said. "One more page." He smiled. It was a small smile, not a large one, but it moved across his face and reached his gray eyes and changed everything about the room by about 3 degrees, the way throwing open a shutter changes the light. He looked back at the book and read one more page. When he left that night, she stood in the doorway again, and watched him go and felt something she had not felt in the 22 years of her life that she could examine and name with certainty. She felt like a person who might be allowed to want something, not something material, not the sealed north wall or the settled debt, something interior and large, something she had been keeping in a locked room because she had believed, on the authority of a woman with a piece of chalk and a room full of watching children, that she was not the kind of person who was entitled to it. He came back the following evening and the one after that. It became a thing between them without either of them naming it, the way the best things sometimes do. After supper, they took turns providing it now, and on the nights he cooked, she ate at his cabin, which was larger than hers and smelled of pine resin and gun oil and wood smoke. He would open whatever book they were working through and read. By the third week, they had finished the Emerson and moved on to a volume of Washington Irving's sketches that made her laugh unexpectedly at odd moments, which pleased him visibly, though he kept his reactions measured and said little about it. One evening, while he was reading a passage about the Hudson Valley, which felt as foreign and lush as another country to a woman who had grown up between granite ridges and pine forests, she said, without planning to, "My teacher said I was slow, that my mind could not hold the shapes of letters." He stopped reading. He did not close the book, but he stopped and looked at her with that direct, even attention that she was learning was the constant quality of him, not a mood, not an effort, just who he was. "She was wrong," he said. Clara looked at the fire. "How do you know? You have not tried to teach me." "I know," he said, "because I have been watching you calculate fence post costs in your head faster than I could do it on paper, and because you described the exact weather pattern that came in last Tuesday, 2 days before it arrived, reading it from nothing but cloud shapes and the way the horses were standing. Your mind holds plenty." She did not know what to do with that. She held it the way you hold something too hot, carefully, at a distance, unsure whether to set it down or pull it closer. "Letters are different," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Do you want to try?" She looked at him. "I am not Miss Hargrove," he said. It was the simplest possible thing to say, and it landed with exactly the weight it deserved. She thought about it for a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind came around the corner of the cabin and found the edge of a loose shingle and worried at it briefly before moving on. She thought about 20 years of walking around words on paper, the way you walk around a dog that has bitten you before, wide and careful and ashamed of the caution. "All right," she said. He closed the book and set it on the table beside him and reached into his coat pocket and produced a short pencil and a folded sheet of brown paper that she recognized as the paper Callaway's store used to wrap dry goods. He unfolded it on the table and smoothed it flat with one large hand. Then he looked at her and said, "What letter do you want to start with?" She said, "C," because it was the first letter of her name, and because if she was going to do this, she was going to do it from the beginning, from her own name, as though she were claiming something back. He wrote it on the paper, a capital C, large and clear, with no flourish. He told her what it sounded like, not just the letter name, but the sound it made in a word. He asked her to say words that started with that sound. She listed them easily: cabin, cold, cattle, creek. He wrote them down and showed her the C at the front of each one. She looked at the shapes, the curve of the letter, the open mouth of it facing right. She traced it in the air with one finger, once, twice. It looked like a jaw opening. She said that aloud and then felt self-conscious about it, but he said, "That is exactly the right kind of thinking. Make it a picture. Make it a story." She looked at the A he wrote next. She said it looked like a mountain, the peak at the top, the crossbar like a ledge. He said, "Then it is a mountain. Every time you see it, it is a mountain." He wrote mountain words: aspen, autumn, ace, arrow. She traced the mountain shape and whispered the sound. By the end of that evening, she could write her own first name in large, careful letters, and when she did it for the first time, tracing each letter in sequence, C-L-A-R-A, something happened to her face that she was unable to entirely control. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes went bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the particular feeling of a thing you have told yourself you cannot do, turning out to be something you can begin. He looked at her name on the brown paper wrapper and said, "That is your name in your handwriting, nobody else's." She pressed her lips together and looked at the paper and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have cracked something open that she was not ready to crack open in front of another person. But she folded the paper and kept it. He understood. He picked up the book and went back to Irving, and she sat in the firelight and listened and felt something entirely new settling around her shoulders like a coat that actually fit. Through the rest of October, they kept their evening rhythm, and the lessons grew longer while the reading stayed equally important to both of them, because she had come to understand that the reading was not only about words. It was the space where they were simply together, where the formality of new acquaintance had no foothold, where she could be entirely herself, and where he, she was increasingly sure, was something very close to entirely himself. She learned things about him in the way you learn things from a person in the periphery of shared attention, not through direct questioning, but through the small, unguarded moments around the edges of the main activity. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had died when Eli was 16, leaving him and an older brother to manage a homestead neither of them wanted. The brother had stayed. Eli had eventually headed west, first to Kansas and then up into the Colorado Territory, where the mountains had apparently agreed with something in his nature in a way no flatland had managed. He spoke of the mountains with a quiet reverence that was entirely unsentimental. He did not romanticize them. He simply respected them the way you respect something that will kill you if you are careless and sustain you if you are not. He had spent 2 winters above the tree line trapping before deciding he wanted something that would last longer than a season, something you could build. He had filed on the 40 acres adjacent to her father's property 3 years before, built his cabin himself, and was building his cattle herd 1 or 2 animals at a time. He was patient about it in a way that she recognized as genuine rather than resigned. He was, she was learning, a man who did not hurry anything except what needed hurrying, and who met everything else, the slow building of a herd, the slow growth of a neighbor's trust, the slow deciphering of letters on a page, with the same unruffled, deliberate steadiness. There was something about this quality that she found more comforting than she had words for, because she had grown up in a town that did not particularly have patience for limitations, and in a schoolroom that had had no patience at all. He never laughed at her mistakes. He never showed impatience, not once, not the smallest flicker of it. When she confused 2 letters, which she did regularly, especially the B and D and P, which her mind seemed determined to rotate in relation to each other without permission, he simply showed her the difference again, and sometimes from a different angle. And when she finally got them separated and stable, he received the success the same way he received the mistakes, with the same level interested attention. She asked him one evening how he had learned to read so well. He thought about this for a moment, the way he thought about most things, and then said that his mother had read to him every night from the time he was old enough to sit still, and that he had learned the way children learn most things, through repetition and through association, and through the particular magic of someone who loves you, trusting you with something they consider worth your time. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about her own mother, dead at 4, a blur of warmth and the smell of lavender, nothing that had lasted long enough to become a memory you could hold properly. She thought about Miss Hargrove's voice, the performance of exasperation, the way the other children had looked at her, the sidelong looks, the cruelty of children who are being shown that cruelty is acceptable. She thought about 20 years of carrying the stone in the boot. She said, "I used to think there was something wrong with how I was made." He looked at her over the open book. His gray eyes were steady. "There's nothing wrong with how you were made. You cannot know that." "I know enough," he said. "The way you managed this homestead alone, the way you handled your father's passing, the way you have been doing everything that needed doing without complaint and without asking anyone for help, those things do not come from a person with something wrong in their making." She looked at the fire for a long moment. She said, "I have been asking you for help." "No," he said, with that small, unannounced smile again. "I offered. That is different." She looked at him and felt the whole thing move inside her chest like a tectonic thing, like something that had been in one position for a very long time, shifting into another. She looked back at the fire before he could see it on her face, because she was not ready to have that conversation. She was not entirely sure she would ever be ready for that conversation. But she was also aware that she was thinking about it more than she was thinking about the north wall, which had been her most pressing concern for 2 months. In November, the real cold arrived, and with it a level of practical urgency that reorganized both their days. He helped her seal the north wall, cutting and fitting new chinking between the logs with a speed and competence that would have taken her 3 times as long alone. She repaid this in kind with labor of her own, helping him move a section of his corral that was undermined by a drainage problem, contributing 2 days of her own time to work that would directly benefit his cattle, which he accepted with the same undramatic reciprocity with which he offered everything. They were developing an economy of mutual aid that was entirely practical and entirely something else as well, and both of them knew it, and neither of them named it yet. One afternoon, in the middle of November, she rode into Ridgecrest for supplies. The town in November had a particular gray quality, the false fronts of the buildings standing against a sky the color of raw iron, the street muddy and churned by wagon wheels and horse traffic. She tied her horse at the rail in front of Callaway's general store and went inside. Thomas Callaway was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and a manner that was not unkind but was relentlessly practical. She gave him her list verbally, as she always did. She had her list in her head, having organized it there before she left the cabin, and he gathered the items. She was checking the weight of a bag of cornmeal when the bell over the door opened and 2 more people came in. One of them was Margaret Hargrove. Miss Hargrove was 61 years old now, and she had retired from teaching 2 years ago when the school board had brought in a younger replacement, a woman from Denver who was said to have actual pedagogical training. Miss Hargrove had aged into the particular kind of severity that some people carry into old age like a decision they made long ago and cannot unmake. She was taller than Clara remembered, or perhaps Clara had simply been smaller then. She was wearing a black wool coat, and she had a younger woman with her, perhaps a niece or a neighbor's daughter. Miss Hargrove did not see Clara at first. She was speaking to the younger woman about something to do with wool prices, and her voice was carrying in the way voices that have spent decades commanding classrooms tend to carry, large, certain, unconsciously occupying the whole room. Clara stood very still beside the cornmeal sacks. She held the particular stillness of a person who does not yet know whether to be seen. Then Miss Hargrove turned and saw her, and her eyes moved over her with the assessment of a woman who had known you at your worst and had formed a permanent judgment based on it. "Clara Sutton," she said, not warmly. Not coldly either, exactly, in the tone of a woman naming a category. "Miss Hargrove," Clara said. There was a brief pause of the kind that comes when 2 people have a history that neither of them wants to lay out in a general store. Miss Hargrove said, "I heard your father passed this spring. My condolences on your loss." "Thank you," Clara said. "Managing the place on your own, are you?" "Yes." Miss Hargrove's eyes moved over her in a way that Clara had once interpreted as professional concern, and now recognized as something closer to the habit of evaluation, the unconscious sorting of people into categories of adequate and inadequate that a certain kind of teacher develops and then never quite unlearns. She said, "Well, it is good that you are practical. Some people have practical gifts even when the academic ones are beyond them." Clara felt the stone in the boot pressing into her arch. She felt the cold sweat that the old shame brought with it, the familiar reflex to make herself small, to nod and agree and retreat as quickly as possible. She felt all of that, and then, and this was new, this was something that had not been there before October, she felt something else underneath it, something that had been growing in the evenings by the fire, letter by letter, word by slow and careful word. She said, "I have been learning to read." Miss Hargrove blinked. She said, "I beg your pardon?" "I have been learning to read," Clara said again evenly. "I expect I will manage it." Miss Hargrove made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a dismissal, but occupied the uncomfortable space between them. She said, "Well, there is no harm in trying, I suppose." Clara paid for her cornmeal. She said, "Good day, Miss Hargrove," and she went out into the gray November street and untied her horse and rode back toward the mountains, and she did not let herself feel the shaking in her hands, until she was past the edge of town and the ridges had closed behind her. That evening she told Eli about it. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her and told him what had happened and what had been said, without dramatization, just the facts of it. But he was a careful observer, and he heard what was underneath the facts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did it feel when you told her you were learning?" She thought about it. She said, "Like I had taken something back that she had taken without asking." He nodded. He said, "Good," she said. She did not believe me. "That is her problem," he said, "not yours." She looked at him across the table and felt the thing in her chest move again, and this time she let it move, just a little, just enough to feel the shape of it. She said, "Why have you been doing this, teaching me, coming every evening? You have your own work to manage." He met her eyes. He was not a man who deflected, she had learned. He said, "Because I wanted to." That's not a full answer. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the cabin fire answered it with a small crackle, the two of them having their own conversation. He said, "Because since the first morning I saw you standing at that fence line, calculating timber costs in your head while holding yourself like you were braced for something, I thought you were the most interesting person I had met in a very long time. And because whatever that school teacher told you, she was wrong, and I wanted you to know that from the inside, rather than just hearing me say it." Clara sat with that for a long time, longer than was comfortable for a conversation. He let her sit with it, which was, she was understanding, one of the fundamental qualities of him. He did not rush her toward reactions or conclusions. He let things be what they were until they became what they needed to become. She said, "I think I have been waiting for the other shoe to drop." He said, "What shoe would that be?" She said, "The part where you find out what I cannot do, and it changes how you see me." He said, "I already know what you cannot do. I have been sitting next to it for 6 weeks. It has not changed anything." She looked at the fire. She said, "It changed things for everyone else." "I am not everyone else," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without emphasis, but the plainness of it had more weight than a more ornamented statement would have. He was simply telling her a fact, and the fact was true, and it sat in the room between them like a stone set in good mortar, quiet, solid, not going anywhere. She looked at him. She made a decision. She said, "No, you are not." Something shifted in the quality of the silence between them, not uncomfortably. The way a room shifts when someone opens the window and the air from outside comes in. Different, changed, but more itself somehow than it was before. He opened the book. He read to her for an hour. She sat in the firelight and listened and felt herself in the room in a new way, as though she had expanded slightly, taken up a little more of the space that was rightfully hers. December came, and the mountains settled under the first serious snowfall, 1.5 feet in 2 days that turned the meadow between their properties into a white, level country with nothing moving across it. He came anyway, pushing through the snow in a way that was purely physical and cost him nothing apparent, knocking the snow from his boots on her step, ducking his head slightly under her doorframe, because even shortened by the act of entering, he was a very tall man. The evenings grew longer, and the lessons deepened. She was making real progress, slower than some people, she thought, but progress was progress. She had most of the letters solid and consistent now. The B and D still gave her occasional trouble, and a few others, but she had developed systems for them, the small personal memory tricks he had encouraged her to build, and the tricks held most of the time. She was beginning to connect letters into short words, to sound them out, to feel the moment when the collection of sounds became something she knew. The first time she sounded out the word fire from the page and looked up at the actual fire burning in the hearth and felt the circuit close, the shape of the word, the sound of the word, the thing in the world, the word named. She went very still, as though the slightest movement might break it. He had watched her face and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. She had turned back to the page and sounded out the next word, and the next, and she did not look up at him because she did not want him to see what was happening to her face, but she was fairly certain he already knew. She was also thinking about him in ways that had nothing to do with books or letters. She thought about him when he was not there, which happened more than she liked to admit. She thought about the way he moved through the world, the particular competence of him, unhurried and total. She thought about the way he had told her she was not everyone else, without any of the self-consciousness that a declaration like that usually came wrapped in, as though it were simply a plain fact he was reporting. She thought about his hands on the page, the large, careful hands of a man who worked with them in hard conditions, but who could also hold a book open and track a line of print with a gentleness that matched nothing else about his physical scale. She admitted to herself one morning while she was breaking ice off the water trough with the back of an axe, somewhere well past admiring. She stopped axing the ice and stood there in the cold white morning light and admitted it to herself with the same directness she tried to bring to everything practical. She had fallen in love with her neighbor, who was also her teacher, who came every evening across the snow-covered meadow with firewood under one arm and the capacity for more patience than anyone had ever offered her in her life. Having admitted it, she did not know what to do with it. She finished with the ice and went inside. Christmas approached, and the town of Ridgecrest organized its annual celebration with the particular community urgency of a small, isolated place that understands the value of gathering in the dark months. There was to be a dance at the meeting hall on Christmas Eve, which was also the church, and the whole community was expected. Clara had attended these dances in years past, usually with her father, and had enjoyed them in the careful way she enjoyed most public gatherings, fully, up to the point where someone inevitably asked her to sign her name to something or read a notice aloud, at which point the enjoyment curdled and she found a reason to move elsewhere. She was in the general store the week before Christmas, collecting a few things she needed, when Thomas Calloway laid a sheet of paper on the counter and said, "Clara, if you could just sign this here receipt for me." She looked at the paper. The familiar cold moved through her. The pen was lying next to it, ready. Calloway was already turning away to the back shelf, not watching, just assuming. She picked up the pen. She signed her name, Clarasutton. Her handwriting was large and not entirely even, and the letters were not perfectly formed, but they were legible, and they were hers, and they were her name. And she set the pen down and looked at what she had written, and felt something so large move through her that she had to breathe through it like weather. Calloway came back, picked up the receipt without looking at it closely, filed it without comment. He had no idea. He would never have any idea. She walked out into the bright, cold December street and stood in the sunlight for a moment, her face turned up to the sky, which was the deep, impossible blue that the Colorado sky achieves in winter when it decides to be beautiful. She went home, and that evening, when Eli came, she showed him the copy she had made on a piece of brown paper. She had practiced it 4 times on scrap paper before she felt confident enough for the actual document. And he looked at her name and her handwriting, and something moved across his face that he did not try to arrange into neutrality. Something that had warmth in it, and what she was fairly sure, reading the particular quality of his gray eyes, was pride. He said, "Clara." She said, "I know." He said, "That is your name." She said, "I know that too." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was enormous, rough with work, warm. He did not say anything more, and she did not need him to. She turned her hand over under his and held on, and neither of them said a word, and the fire said everything that needed saying. He held her hand for a moment, and then a little longer than a moment, and then she looked up from their joined hands to his face and found him already looking at her. The question was there in his expression, open and honest and entirely undemanding. He would not push for anything she was not offering. That quality, she thought, that absolute refusal to press her toward any reaction she had not arrived at herself, was the quality that had built the foundation of everything between them, and she trusted it as completely as she had ever trusted anything. She said, "Are you coming to the Christmas dance?" He said, "I was not planning on it." She said, "I'm asking you to come." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the deliberateness of him. He said, "Then I will come." The Christmas Eve dance was everything it usually was, Fiddles in a squeeze box, the meeting hall strung with pine boughs and tallow candles, the whole town in their best clothes, the floorboards vibrating with boots keeping time. She wore her blue dress, the one her father had bought her the last Christmas before he died, deep blue wool that fit her well and that she knew suited her. She had braided her dark hair and pinned it and then pulled it partially back out again because the full braid felt like too much formality for a woman who mostly managed a homestead by herself in the mountains. He arrived a little after 7. She was standing near the punch bowl with a woman named Ruth Harmer, the blacksmith's wife, who was telling her about a complicated situation involving a neighbor's chickens. Clara was listening with the partial attention of a person whose eyes are on the door. He came in, and she saw him immediately. He had dressed for it. He wore a dark wool coat she had not seen before, clearly newer than his working canvas, and he had trimmed his beard to something neater than usual, and his hair was combed back, though a few dark strands had already escaped this arrangement. He was, in the warm candlelight of the crowded hall, more than usually conspicuous, because he was simply very large and very present in the way that some people are, filling space not with noise but with the particular solid gravity of their existence. He found her across the room with his eyes the way she had found him at the door, as though they had agreed beforehand where to look. He crossed the room toward her. People stepped aside not because he asked them to, but because the body makes instinctive calculations about trajectory and mass, and he moved through the crowd with the same unhurried certainty he moved through everything. Ruth Harmer said something beside her that Clara did not entirely track. He stopped in front of her. He said, "You look beautiful." She said, "You cleaned up well yourself." He almost smiled. She had learned to read the almost smiles as clearly as the real ones. In some ways, they told her more. He said, "Dance with me?" She had danced before at these community events, the familiar real-style dances that everyone knew from childhood. She took his hand. He was a careful dancer, deliberate in a way that avoided disaster, and he held her with the same attention he brought to everything. She was aware of his size in a new way in this context, not his height or his breadth or the muscles in his arms, which she was at this point reasonably well acquainted with as practical realities, but the way he used all of that size with a very precise economy to make sure that she was steady and unstepped on and exactly where she intended to be. It was an oddly perfect metaphor for everything he had been doing since October. Between dances, they stood together near the wall and watched the room and talked about the people they both knew, comparing notes on who was who in the way of neighbors who have been talking regularly, and find their knowledge of the shared world building in tandem. He had a quiet, dry wit that he deployed infrequently but accurately, and she laughed at his observations more than she laughed at anyone else's, which she had decided to simply accept as one of the facts of her current situation. Late in the evening, when the dancing was winding down and the children had mostly been put to sleep on their parents' coats in the corner, and the older men were at one end of the room having a serious conversation about spring cattle prices, she found herself standing next to him in the doorway, half inside and half out, the cold night air clean and sharp behind them and the warm candlelit room in front. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "You can ask me anything." She thought about how to say it, and then decided that she had spent enough of her life being indirect about things as a protective measure, and that she was going to try the straightforward approach. She said, "What are we doing, you and I?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "What do you think we are doing?" "I'm asking because I want to know what you think." He turned to face her more fully. The candlelight from behind him made his outline very clear against the dark outside. He said, "I think I am in love with you. I think I have been for some time. I think I've been trying to give you enough time and enough space to decide how you felt about that without it being a thing you had to manage on top of everything else you were managing." She looked at him. She said, "Why, you could have mentioned it." He said, "I am mentioning it now." She said, "Yes, you are." She could feel her heart doing something very loud and undignified inside her chest. She said, "I am in love with you too. Since some time in November, I think, though I am not entirely sure of the exact date." He looked at her for one more moment with that full, undivided attention. Then he reached up and cupped her face in one large, rough hand. and she leaned into it, and he kissed her. It was a careful kiss, with the same quality everything about him had, deliberate and entirely present, and neither rushing ahead nor holding back, just exactly what it was. She felt it from her lips to the base of her spine, and she reached up with both hands and gripped the lapels of his dark wool coat and kissed him back with all the feeling she had been carrying since November, and some that was older than that, some that had been looking for a safe place to be itself for considerably longer. When they separated, she was slightly breathless, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open and warm and undefended in a way that the face of a very contained person rarely is, and which meant that much more because of its rarity. She said, "You took a long time," he said. "I wanted to be sure," she said. "I am sure," he said. "So am I." January arrived, and with it the deep cold of the high country winter, the kind of cold that does not ask permission, that gets into every uninsulated corner and makes the livestock anxious and turns the world outside into a landscape of white and blue and the deep, absorbing silence that comes when temperature drops below the point at which things move. They spent more time in each other's company than was strictly explicable by practical necessity, and stopped trying to explain it. He still read to her every evening. This had not changed with the change in their relationship. If anything, it had deepened, because now she sat beside him rather than across from him, and followed the lines on the page with her own finger as he read, connecting the sounds she heard with the shapes she was learning, the dual processing of the story happening on two levels at once. She was reading small things on her own now, short words, labels, simple sentences. He brought her a copy of a newspaper once, and she worked through a single short paragraph in the space of half an hour, sounding out each word, backtracking, rereading, until she had the whole of it. And when she looked up, she was grinning in a way she could not have suppressed if she tried. He said, "Read it to me." She did. She read it aloud, slowly, with the particular stop and start rhythm of new reading, but she read every word correctly. It was a paragraph about a cattle sale in Denver, not the most thrilling piece of literature ever committed to paper, but she read it with the same intensity she might have given to the finest poetry, because the subject was not the point. The point was the shape of the letters under her finger, and the sound of the words in her mouth and the meaning of the sentences arriving in her mind, and she had done it herself, had assembled it herself from the parts she had been given, and it was hers. He was watching her face the whole time. When she finished, he said, "Again. Faster this time." She read it again. It was faster, not much faster, but faster. She folded the newspaper and set it in her lap and said, "Miss Hargrove would be very surprised." He said, "Miss Hargrove was wrong." She looked at the fire. She said, "She really was, wasn't she?" He said, "She really was." She thought about the 9-year-old girl who had walked home through the snow without her coat, carrying a verdict she had not deserved. She thought about the 20 years of walking around the words on the page, wide and careful. She thought about all the things she had not asked for, and not done, and not attempted on the strength of a judgment made by someone who had looked at a child struggling with letters, and seen not a child who needed a different approach, but a child who was a category, a write-off, an inconvenience of limited potential. She said, "I think she should know." Eli looked at her. "That you can read?" "That she was wrong," Clara said. "I do not need her to apologize. I do not particularly want an apology. I just think she should know." She paused. "I want to go into the schoolroom." He said, "The new teacher?" "I want to ask her if I can practice there, reading, if she will let me use the books." She looked at him. "And I want to go when Miss Hargrove can see me doing it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want me to come with you?" She considered it. She said, "Yes, but you do not need to speak for me." He said, "I never would." "I know," she said. "That is why I want you there." They went the following Thursday morning, riding into Ridgecrest on his larger horse, because the snow was deep and it carried 2 people more reliably. She sat behind him with her arms around his waist and felt the steady movement of him against the cold, and thought that this was perhaps the most secure she had ever felt, while traveling toward something that frightened her. The new teacher was a woman named Helen Price, 28 years old, from Denver, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an organized, efficient manner that was entirely different from Miss Hargrove's theatrical authority. She received them with curiosity rather than wariness, listened to Clara's request without visible judgment, and said that Clara was welcome to use the schoolroom on Thursday mornings before classes and that she would be glad to help her if she wanted guidance. Clara thanked her. She looked around the schoolroom, the same hard benches, the same smell of chalk dust and wood smoke, the same narrow windows with their view of the mountain ridge. The place had the peculiar quality of being both exactly as she remembered it and entirely different. Smaller, perhaps, or perhaps she was simply larger now. Miss Hargrove happened to be passing the school just as they were leaving, on her way to Callaway's store with her market basket, which Clara privately thought might have been less of a coincidence than it appeared, given that Ridgecrest was a small town where it was difficult to do anything without someone knowing about it in advance. Miss Hargrove stopped. She looked at Clara. She looked at the schoolroom door that Clara had just come through. Clara said, "Good morning, Miss Hargrove. I have just arranged to use the schoolroom for reading practice on Thursday mornings." She paused. "I expect I will be reading properly by spring." Miss Hargrove's face did something complicated. She said, after a moment, "I see." Clara said, "You told me I was incapable. I was 9 years old, and you told me in front of everyone that I was incapable of learning to read." The older woman was very still. Clara said, "I'm not angry. Or rather, I was angry for a long time, and I'm not anymore. Not particularly. I just want you to know that you were wrong about me." She said it without heat and without satisfaction. Plainly, the way she had learned from Eli that plain things, said without decoration, had more weight than dramatic ones. Miss Hargrove stood in the cold street with her market basket and her black coat and her complicated face, and she said, after a silence that lasted long enough to mean something, "I may have been too hasty in my assessment." Clara said, "Yes, you were." She said, "Good day." And she walked to where Eli was waiting with the horse, and she did not look back, because she was finished looking back. He helped her up onto the horse and mounted in front of her, and she put her arms around his waist, and he covered her hands briefly with one of his own, and they rode back up toward the mountains, and she felt, for the first time, that the stone in the boot was gone. Completely. Not reduced or repositioned, but gone, as though it had dissolved in the cold morning air of the main street of Ridgecrest, Colorado, in the January of 1874. February was the month the snow got serious, 3 successive storms that left the drifts at the cabin door chest high and turned the world into a landscape of pure white and pure quiet. They were effectively snowbound for a week at a stretch, and they spent this time in the way that snowbound people in mountain cabins have always spent it, close together, near heat, making the best possible use of the available hours. She read more every day now, simple texts, then less simple ones. She made mistakes and corrected them. She asked questions when she did not understand a word, and he answered them without making her feel that she should have known. She had developed, with time and practice, a reading style that was entirely her own, not particularly fast, but thorough, with a kind of attention to individual words that was, he told her once, rather like the attention of a poet. She turned words over, looked at their component parts, connected them to other words. She learned words the way she had always learned everything important, through her hands, through repetition, through the building of associations that were personal and specific, and therefore lasting. She was reading to him by February, turning the tables, sitting across from him with the Emerson book that had started the whole thing, reading passages aloud in her careful, unhurried voice while he sat with his long legs stretched toward the fire and his gray eyes on her face. He listened the way she had listened to him, with full attention, without performance. When she stumbled, he did not jump in immediately, giving her time to find the word herself, and she usually did. One evening she read a passage that her father's careful hand had underlined in pencil many years ago, a passage about a man standing in a field at night with the stars overhead, feeling himself to be both small and limitless. She stopped when she got to the end of it, her finger on the pencil mark, and was quiet for a moment. She said, "He underlined this." Eli said, Your father? She said, I never knew he had read any of it. I thought he kept the books for sentiment. She touched the pencil mark very gently. He read this and thought it was worth marking. He said nothing, because nothing was what the moment needed. She said, he would have been glad about this, about learning to read. She looked up. About you. He said, I would have been glad to know him. She put the book down and crossed the room and sat down beside him in the wide chair that had been her father's and was now theirs. And he put his arm around her and she put her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that in the firelight while the snow moved against the window in its long, patient way. And she felt the completeness of the evening in a way that she understood was not ordinary, that many people never found, and that she had very nearly not found either, had been a single autumn away from not finding, had she been slightly less desperate about a downed fence and slightly less honest in the moment he looked at the books on her shelf. Spring came to the San Juan Mountains the way it always does, not gently, not suddenly, but in the argumentative way of high country, 3 warm days followed by a cold snap, mud and snow existing simultaneously, the aspens stubbornly bare until 1 week in late April, when the whole world seemed to remember what it was supposed to be doing and went green all at once. Eli had proposed in March. He had done it the way he did everything, without ceremony but with total seriousness. They had been sitting at his kitchen table after supper, she with a newspaper in front of her and a pencil in her hand, because she had taken to writing notes on difficult words in the margins, and he had set down his coffee and looked at her across the table and said, Clara, I want to marry you. She had put down her pencil. She had looked at him. She had said, That is not a question. He had said, No, it is not. I am telling you what I want. Do you want it too? She had said, Yes. He had said, Then we are agreed. She had laughed, because he was absolutely impossible and absolutely himself, and she had reached across the table and taken his large, rough hand in hers, and they had been agreed. The wedding was in May, in the church that was also the meeting hall, on an afternoon when the sky was the brilliant blue of Colorado in late spring, and the aspens along the ridge had gone fully green, and the whole world smelled of snowmelt and pine and the particular rich sweetness of high-altitude earth coming back to life. Helen Price sat in the front row. Thomas Calloway and his wife sat in the second. Ruth Harmer was there, and a dozen other people she knew. She wore the blue wool dress again, with a ribbon of white at the collar that Ruth Harmer had given her, and she carried a handful of wild columbines that she had found that morning along the creek bank, purple and yellow, entirely ordinary and entirely right. She walked down the aisle of the small church without her father, and felt his absence and his presence simultaneously, the absence of the man who could not be there, and the presence of what he had built and left her, the homestead, the hard competence, the bones of a life that she was now building differently than either of them had imagined. Eli was waiting at the front of the church in a dark coat that was clearly new and not particularly comfortable on him, and when she reached him, he held out his hand, and she put hers in it, and she looked up at his face and found the same thing she always found there, the full, undivided attention, the warmth that he did not arrange or perform, the gray eyes that had looked at her from the very first morning without any of the reductions that other people's eyes had always carried. The minister, a gentleman named Reverend Parks, who had come to Ridgecrest 2 years prior and had not yet formed permanent opinions about anyone in it, read the words of the ceremony from his prayer book, and when he asked for the vows, Eli said his plainly and completely, without faltering, looking at her face the entire time. She said hers. She heard her own voice in the quiet church, steady and clear, saying words she had prepared not on paper, but in the interior space where she had kept everything important for 22 years, the space that she had begun to open up in the evenings last October when a quiet, large man with an axe and a book of Emerson had offered her something she had not known how to want. When Reverend Parks said they were married, Eli put both of his large hands on her face and kissed her with the same quality as the first kiss, deliberate, entirely present, nothing held back, and the small congregation in the wooden church made the sounds that small congregations make, and the aspens outside the windows were very green against a very blue sky. The celebration afterward was a modest one by the standards of larger settlements, held in the same building with the benches pushed to the walls and the fiddles brought out. She danced every dance with him, and when her feet began to ache, she sat with him near the wall and watched the other people dance and ate cold chicken and cornbread and felt the particular quality of a day that is so fully itself that no part of it needs anything added. Ruth Harmer danced past them at one point and called out something about them being a proper pair, and a man named George Webb, the town's veterinarian and the best fiddle player in the valley, paused between songs and toasted them with his cup, and Clara looked at the room full of people who knew her and felt herself, for what she thought was the first time in a long time, without any reservation about being known. They went home that evening to the homestead that had been her father's and was now theirs. They had agreed, after the practical conversations of engaged people with 2 properties and 1 future, that they would expand her cabin rather than his, because her land had the better water and because the cabin already had a history in it that neither of them wanted to leave behind. He would sell his cattle through the summer and reinvest in building the herd on her land, and they would seal the north wall properly and add 2 rooms before the next winter. She unlocked the cabin door with her own key, went inside, and lit the lamp on the table. He came in behind her and set down the wrapped parcels of food that Ruth Harmer had pressed on them as they left, and looked around the room in the lamplight in the way of a person who has finally arrived somewhere they intended to reach. She said, "Welcome home," he said. It already was. She crossed the room to him and put her arms around his waist, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the lamplight of the cabin that smelled of wood smoke and the particular domestic history of her family. And outside the May night was cold and clear and entirely dark except for the stars, which in the San Juans at elevation are not suggestions, but declarations. Summer moved through the valley in the long, golden way of mountain summers, hot in the day and cool at night, with a quality of light in the afternoon hours that made everything look briefly like it was made of the same material as the inside of a lantern. They worked together the way they had been working together since October, side by side, without excessive discussion of who did what, each finding the work that needed doing and doing it, the way 2 people who are genuinely suited to each other tend to organize a shared life. He expanded the cabin through June and July with the methodical efficiency of a man who had built his own shelter and knew what he was doing. She worked beside him when the work could use 2 pairs of hands and managed the rest of the operation, the cattle, the garden she had started in May, the laying hens that had now multiplied to 8 with the acquisition of a rooster from George Webb's farm, when it could not. In the evenings they still read. She was reading chapter books now, full novels, working through them at the pace of a chapter a night, sometimes 2. She had read Irving's entire collection and had started on a volume of Charles Dickens that Helen Price had lent her, with the quiet enthusiasm of someone who loves a book and wants to share it, and the Dickens was working through her mind like a fire through dry grass, fast and illuminating and leaving her changed in its wake. She read the Dickens to herself, alone, in the mornings before he was up, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the book, and sometimes she was still reading when he came in from the first barn check of the day, and found her with her finger on the page and an expression on her face that he had come to associate with a particular quality of absorption, and he would pour his own coffee and sit down across from her and wait until she surfaced. He was reading to her in the evenings, too, still, because this had never been simply a matter of her accessing words. It had always been a thing they did together, a shared act of attention, as intimate as any other intimacy and more sustaining than some. She curled against his side in the wide chair in front of the fire while he read, her head against the warmth of his shoulder, his deep voice moving through the room while the summer dark settled outside. She thought sometimes about the 9-year-old girl walking home through the snow and about the young woman standing at the fence line in October with her arms folded and her jaw set, braced for something she could not name. She thought about the particular shape of a life that had been organized around a wound, and what happened when the wound healed, not disappeared, because wounds do not entirely disappear, but closed, became scar tissue, became a part of the body that was there and had been through something, and was now simply solid. She mentioned Miss Hargrove to Eli once, in July. They were on the porch in the evening, watching the last light leave the high peaks, and she said, almost inconsequentially, I do not think about her much anymore, he said. Good, she said. I used to think about what she said almost every day, when I went to the store, when someone asked me to read something, when I had to sign my name to anything. She looked at the mountains. It was like she was always in the room, he said. And now, she said, now the room is too full of other things. He reached out and took her hand where it was resting on the porch rail. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. In August, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told him, turning it over in the careful interior way she processed everything important. She thought about what it meant and what it asked of her, and what it would require of both of them. She thought about the north wall, which was now fully sealed, and the 2 new rooms, one of which had been intended from the beginning as a child's room, though neither of them had said so explicitly. She thought about her father, and about her mother who had died too young, and about the particular nature of love when it becomes more than 2 people. She told him on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with the lamp burning between them and the sound of the cattle through the open window. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. His large hands were on the table, and she watched them, because his hands always told her things that his face did not always show. They tightened slightly, then relaxed, then moved toward her and covered hers. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am well." He said, "Are you frightened?" She considered it honestly. She said, "A little." "You?" He said, "Yes." He said it without hesitation or shame, which she loved about him. He said, "A little, in the way of something I want very much." She said, "Then we are agreed." He smiled. The real smile, not the almost smile, the one that changed the room. He said, "Then we are agreed." Autumn came back around, the second autumn since she had stood at the downed fence and decided to accept his help. The aspens went gold again, and the peaks whitened and the air sharpened into that clarifying cold that was not yet winter, but was its announcement. She was showing by September the particular change in her shape that she had watched in other women and was now experiencing in herself with a combination of wonder and practical adjustment. She was reading fluently by autumn, not with the ease of someone who had done it from childhood. There were still words that required a moment's attention, still occasional reversals that she had learned to catch and correct, but fluently, genuinely, in a way that she could not have imagined possible in the early October of the year before, when the letters on the page had been as illegible to her as if they were written in a foreign alphabet. She was reading Dickens still, and Irving, and a natural history book that Eli had brought from a bookseller in Denver during a supply trip in August, a thick volume with illustrations of birds and mammals of the Rocky Mountain region that she found herself consulting with the same attention she gave to weather signs and herd behavior. She had also discovered, with a pleasure she had not anticipated, poetry, a slim volume of Emily Dickinson that Helen Price had given her, which she read slowly and with great attention, the way the poems seemed to require. She read a Dickinson poem to him one evening, a short one, about a slant of winter light. She read it once, and then he asked her to read it again, and she did. And they were both quiet after it in the way that a very good piece of writing sometimes produces silence as its natural response. He said, "She was a remarkable woman." Clara said, "She kept her words to herself for most of her life." He said, "You did not." She looked at him. She said, "I kept mine in a different way. I just did not have them on a page." She looked at the poem in her hand. "I think I understand some of what she was doing with them now, though." He said, "What was she doing?" She said, "Making the inside of her mind visible, giving it a shape that someone else could hold." She looked up. "That is what learning to read gave me. Not just the reading, the knowing that the inside of a mind can go on a page, and that someone else's page can come into my mind. It is not just letters. It is a kind of company." He looked at her with an expression that had all the warmth in it that she had ever needed, and he said, "Yes, that is exactly what it is." She tucked the poem back into the book. She said, "You gave me that. You know that?" He said, "You gave it to yourself. I just sat in the chair." She said, You just sat in the chair for months in the cold, every single evening, with unlimited patience and absolutely no condescension, and you rid me the interior of your mind, and then you helped me find the door to mine." She looked at him. "Do not minimize what that was," he said quietly. "I do not minimize it. It was the best thing I have done." She crossed the room and sat beside him and put his hand on the curve of her belly where their child was already making its presence known in the particular internal way of a small person beginning to practice being a person. And he felt it and was still, the way he was still before everything important, the quality of total presence that was the constant of him. And she thought, this is the room. Not the schoolroom with its chalk dust and its shame, not the cold street where Miss Hargrove had looked at her with the eyes of a permanent verdict, but this room, with the fire and the lamp and the books on the shelf, and this man whose hands were large enough to hold everything worth holding. The baby arrived in February, in the deep of the second winter, born on a night when the snow came down steady and the temperature outside was serious in the way of high-altitude February temperatures. He was a boy. She had known somehow from early on, without any particular evidence, a certainty the way weather certainty came to her, from some combination of reading and instinct that defied explanation. They named him Henry, for her father. He was a solid, dark-haired, loud-opinionated infant who established his personality within the first week of his life by making it abundantly clear that he had specific requirements regarding warmth and proximity, and that he intended to communicate these requirements at full volume until they were met. Eli held him in the crook of his enormous arm with the careful, total attention he brought to every important thing, and the baby looked up at the large face above him with the unfocused wonder of new eyes encountering the world, and she sat in the bed, watching them, and felt the kind of happiness that is so full it leaves no room for anything else. Spring came. Henry grew, as babies do, with the relentless efficiency of young living things that have been given what they need and are simply getting on with the business of existence. He had Eli's gray eyes and her dark hair and a disposition that seemed to combine his father's steadiness with his mother's fierce observational intensity, in a way that already suggested he was going to be a person of considerable opinion. She nursed him in the mornings in the wide chair in front of the fire, and she often had a book open beside her, reading a paragraph at a time, the child and the words coexisting in the same space, the way the most important things in a life learn eventually to coexist. She read to him too, before he was old enough to understand, the same way Eli's mother had read to him, and the way she now understood reading to be passed down, not as instruction, but as immersion, as the simple act of a trusted voice giving a child the sound of language organized with care and attention. Eli read to Henry in the evenings as he had read to her. He had a collection of stories now, folk tales, natural history passages, poetry when the mood suited, and he read them in his low, deliberate voice while the baby lay in his lap with his gray eyes wide open, absorbing. She sat across from them and watched and thought about all the things that were happening in that room, not just the words on the page, but the inheritance being offered, the implicit message of a grown man choosing to sit every evening and give his most careful attention to something that required patience and love and the willingness to be present. She thought, he will grow up knowing this is what you do. He will grow up knowing that reading is a thing men do, a thing worth time, a thing that is not weakness, but the opposite of weakness. She thought about the 9-year-old girl and felt something she could only describe as gratitude, not uncomplicated gratitude, because nothing about 20 years of carrying that stone was simple, but gratitude for the specific sequence of events that had led from that cold afternoon to this warm one, from the chalk-dusted certainty of Miss Hargrove's dismissal to this room in this mountain valley with this family. That summer, one afternoon while Eli was out with the cattle and Henry was asleep in his cradle and the golden light lay across the floor of the cabin, she sat down at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pencil, and she wrote a letter. To no one in particular. To herself, perhaps, or to the child she had been, or to the woman she was becoming. She wrote slowly, in her large, careful letters, stopping to think of words and sometimes to look them up in the dictionary that had joined the shelf by the door, the same shelf where her father's 3 books had stood. The shelf was fuller now. They had been adding to it all year. The letter said, "I was told I could not learn. I was 9 years old, and a woman with authority told me in front of everyone that my mind could not hold the shapes of letters. I believed her for 20 years. I was wrong to believe her. She was wrong to say it. I can read. I can write. These are not things that came easily to me, and there are people for whom they come more easily, and that is simply how things are, and it does not mean that I am less. I have a husband who knows the mountains and knows the words that describe them, and who gave me both things as gifts freely offered with nothing asked in return but my presence. I have a son who will grow up knowing that his mother reads. I have a shelf of books that I have read myself, with my own eyes and my own understanding, and I will read more. I am telling this to no one except myself, because I am the one who most needs to hear it." She folded the letter and kept it. She added it to the shelf, tucked between the Emerson and the Dickinson, where it stayed without explanation to visitors, its meaning known only to her and to him when she showed it to him that evening. He read it standing at the shelf, holding it in both hands, and she watched his face. When he was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It is a good letter." She said, "It was easier to write than I expected." He said, "The best things usually are, once you finally do them." She took the letter from his hands and put it back on the shelf. She said, "I want Henry to read it someday, when he is old enough." He said, "He will." She said, "I want him to know it was hard and that it was worth it." He said, "He will know that. We will make sure of it." She looked at him. She said, "We." He said, "We." She reached up and put her hand on his jaw, the beard that was trimmed to the same width as always, the face she had been reading now as fluently as any page, knowing every mood in it, every small variation in expression that told her where he was. He covered her hand with his, and outside the summer light was long and golden on the mountains, and Henry was beginning to make the particular soft sounds that preceded waking up, and the cattle were moving along the fence line in their placid way, and the aspens along the creek were green and steady, and the shelf of books by the door had room on it still, because they were not done. In the years that followed, the cabin grew with the family. The 2 rooms Eli had added became 3 when their daughter arrived in the spring of 1876, a red-faced, decisive infant who announced her opinions even more emphatically than Henry had. They named her May for Eli's mother. She had dark hair and her mother's eyes, a warm brown that turned gold in certain lights, and she had from an early age her father's quality of steady attention. She would watch something for a very long time before touching it, the way a man who respects a thing will look at it carefully before he lifts it. Clara was reading everything now. She worked through the books in the Ridgecrest schoolroom library with Helen Price's enthusiastic assistance, and she ordered volumes from Denver twice a year through Callaway's store, a luxury that had once been incomprehensible to her and was now a planned and anticipated expense. She read natural history and fiction and poetry and, with some effort, a legal text about land claims, because there had been a boundary dispute with a rancher to the south who believed a persuasive story and a loud voice were adequate substitutes for legal documentation, and she had found the relevant provisions herself and quoted them chapter and verse at the subsequent meeting, and the dispute had resolved with notable efficiency. Helen Price remarked, at a town gathering in the autumn of 1876, that Clara Cross had become one of the most well-read people in the valley, and she said it as a plain fact, which it was, and Clara received the fact with the composure of a woman who has learned that she is allowed to know things and is no longer surprised to be seen knowing them, but who still, in the private interior of herself, finds a particular quality of pleasure in it that has never entirely lost the edge of its newness. Eli had built the herd to 32 cattle by the summer of 1876, a number that was making the operation genuinely viable, and he talked about expanding the pasture land into the northern section of the property where the meadow went long and level in the direction of the high tree line. He talked about it at the kitchen table in the evenings with the same quality he talked about everything practical, without drama, with a thorough accounting of what it would require and what it might yield, and with the particular focused pleasure of a man who is building something that has the quality of permanence. Henry, at 2.5, had the vocabulary and the confidence of a person twice his age, which Eli attributed to the reading and Clara attributed to his personality. And they were both right. He followed his father around the property with the earnest purposefulness of a small person who has decided that this is how things work, and that he intends to be part of how they work. And Eli included him in everything possible with a patience and consistency that she watched and thought was the straightforward expression of who he had always been. A man who had patience built into his nature as a load-bearing element. She read to both children in the evenings, and Eli read to both children in the evenings. And on the nights when she was very tired, he read to all three of them. And on the nights when something about the quality of the lamp and the fire and the children falling asleep was more than usually exactly right, she would watch him reading, his large, dark-haired, strong presence filling the chair by the fire, the open book small in his large hands, his voice moving through the words with its particular measured care. And she would feel the completeness of things with such force that she would have to look away before the feeling became too large for the room. On a September evening in 1876, 3 years after the morning she had stood at the downed fence and decided to accept help from a stranger, she sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Eli was outside checking the cattle, and she pulled out the piece of brown paper from the back of the shelf where she had kept it, the original brown paper from Callaway's store, with C and A, and the other letters written in his hand, and her finger traces visible still in the slight indentation of the paper. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got out a new sheet of paper and her best pencil, and she wrote, in her own hand, the alphabet. All 26 letters, capital and lowercase, in her now familiar handwriting that had developed over 3 years of regular use into something distinctly her own, slightly larger than average, even and clear, with a slight forward lean that Eli had once said looked like it was going somewhere with purpose. She wrote the alphabet, and then she wrote, I know all of these now. She wrote, I read Dickens last winter and made Eli read the ending twice because the first time I did not want it to be over. She wrote, I read to my children every night. She wrote, I am not what Miss Hargrove said I was. I am what I have made myself, with help, which is the honest truth about how most good things get made. She wrote, I am a wife and a mother and a woman in the mountains, and I can read every word on every page. She was still writing when Eli came in from outside, bringing the cold air with him, stamping the mud from his boots. He came to look over her shoulder at what she was writing, and she let him read it, because there was nothing in it she had not already told him in one form or another. He read it through. Then he put both hands on her shoulders from behind, his large, warm hands, and said nothing. She put her hand over one of his. Henry made a sound from his room, not waking, just the vocal meditation of a sleeping child, and then was quiet. Outside, the September wind was finding the corners of the cabin and checking them, the way it did every autumn, making its assessment of the year's ceiling work. The mountains stood in their permanent places above the valley, the peaks already white with the first dusting of the season's snow, the lower ridges still carrying the gold of the aspens, the whole world organized in the layered way of mountain country that has seen every kind of weather and is prepared for the next kind. She finished the last line of what she was writing. She set the pencil down. She looked at the words on the page, her words in her hand on a page that had once been the most foreign country she knew, and she felt, completely and without reservation, that she was home. He moved around from behind her and sat down across the table, the way he had sat across the table from her 1,000 evenings, the familiar shape of him in the lamplight, the gray eyes and the dark hair, and the wide, strong presence of a man who had come down out of the mountains and stayed. She looked at him. She said, I love you. He said, I know. He said it with the warmth of a man who has been told this many times and has never once taken it as ordinary. He said, I love you too. She slid the paper across the table to him. He picked it up and read it carefully, the way he read everything. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her with the full, undivided attention of the gray eyes, and in that expression was everything she had ever needed. The man who had looked at her at the fence line and not seen a limitation, the teacher who had never laughed, the reader who had given the interior of great minds to a woman who had been told she could not access them, the husband who had understood that love was not a single declaration, but a daily practice of presence and attention, and the small, consistent acts of someone who chooses you. She said, "Are you happy?" He said, "Yes." Plainly, completely, the way he said everything true. "Are you?" She looked at the lamp and the letter and the shelf of books and the room full of the evidence of a life built from what they had both brought to the shared table, his patience and his mountains and his reading voice, her competence and her fierceness and her willingness, at last, to want the thing she had been told she was not allowed to want. She said, "Yes." Outside, the mountains stood in their ancient, indifferent way, holding the valley in the cold September dark. Inside, the lamp burned, the children slept. The books on the shelf stood in their row, Emerson and Dickens and Irving and Dickinson and all the rest, and the brown paper original with its first letters and the letter she had written to herself, and now this newest page in her own hand. She picked up the paper and added it to the shelf, pressed against the others, the whole of it together, the beginning and the middle and the now of it, the shape of a story that had started with a downed fence and a man with an axe and a willingness to sit in a chair every evening and give someone the most valuable thing that one person can give another, which is the unqualified belief that they are capable of more than they have been told. She stood at the shelf for a moment with her hand on the spines of the books. Eli came to stand beside her. She felt the warmth of him at her shoulder. She took down the Emerson, the first book, the one that had started the whole thing. She turned it to the first page. She read aloud the first sentence, not because she needed to, not anymore, but because some things are worth returning to, worth reading again with the eyes you have now, rather than the eyes you had then. Her voice was steady and clear in the quiet room. He listened.